Some men inherit power, others seize it with bloodied hands and the silence of everyone too afraid to object. Duke Cadric Blackthorne did neither. He built his dominion the way winter builds itself across northern Edevane, slowly, mercilessly, until every living thing either bent or broke beneath its weight. They called him the Wolf of the North. They whispered his name like a curse behind closed doors and smiled to his face at banquets because the alternative was unthinkable. And on the night Lady Seraphine Valmont first entered Blackthorne Keep, dragged there by debt and a dead father's broken promises, even the storm outside seemed to quiet itself, as though the sky understood something dangerous had just begun. Stay until the end. You will want to see how this unravels. Rain struck the black stone walls of Blackthorne Keep like musket fire. Inside the great hall, 200 aristocrats sat frozen in their velvet chairs while Lord Harlan Crewe was hauled across the marble floor by 4 soldiers in ceremonial black. His knees left wet streaks on the polished stone. His hands were bound behind his back with chains heavy enough to anchor a warship. He had been sobbing for 20 minutes. Nobody moved to help him. Duke Cadric Blackthorne watched from the elevated throne at the far end of the chamber, one leg crossed over the other, gloved fingers resting against the carved wolf skull on his armrest. His face betrayed nothing, not satisfaction, not contempt, not even mild interest. He looked the way a surgeon looks at an infected wound before reaching for the blade. The charges were straightforward. Crewe had diverted grain shipments from 3 starving villages during the worst winter Edevane had seen in 40 years. 16 people had died. Women, children, old men whose bones were too brittle for the cold. Crewe had sold the stolen grain to merchants across the southern border and used the profits to fund a second estate for his mistress. "Your Grace," Crewe's voice cracked against the marble. "I beg you. I have served this house faithfully for 11 years, Cadric said without inflection. "I remember." "Then show mercy. For the sake of everything I have given—" "What you have given?" Cadric uncrossed his legs slowly. The entire hall tensed. "You have given me 11 years of adequate service." Adequate. Not exceptional. Not indispensable. Adequate. He rose from the throne and descended the staircase with mechanical precision, each boot striking the stone like the ticking of a clock counting down the final seconds of something irreversible. "And in return, I gave you title, land, revenue from 3 territories that your grandfather could not have dreamed of holding. I gave you protection from creditors your family had accumulated for 2 generations before you were born." He stopped 3 feet from the kneeling man. 16 dead, Cadric continued. "You understand that the number itself is irrelevant to me. I do not count peasants the way a shepherd counts sheep. But those villages produce iron. Iron builds weapons. Weapons secure borders. You did not steal grain, Crewe. You weakened my northern frontier during wartime to purchase silk sheets for a woman who will forget your name within 6 months. Crewe's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Strip him," Cadric ordered without turning around. "Title, lands, family inheritance through the 3rd generation. His wife retains her dowry properties. His children will be fostered under crown jurisdiction until they reach majority." He paused. "And the mistress receives nothing. She can find another fool to build her a house." The hall erupted into controlled whispers, not outrage, not sympathy, calculation. Every nobleman in that room was recalculating their own vulnerabilities, measuring the distance between their secrets and the Duke's reach. Cadric returned to his throne the way a predator returns to higher ground, without haste, without apology. That was how power worked in the North, not through violence alone, but through the absolute certainty that violence would arrive the moment it became necessary. Fear was not cruelty. Fear was architecture. It held the structure upright when loyalty inevitably failed. Among the silent witnesses pressed against the eastern wall stood Lady Seraphine Valmont, 23 years old, dressed in borrowed silver velvet that did not quite fit her shoulders, watching the spectacle with dark eyes that refused to look away, even when every instinct told her she should. She had arrived at Blackthorne Keep 9 days ago, not by choice, never by choice. Her father, Lord Edmond Valmont, had died 3 months prior, owing the Blackthorne estate a debt so enormous that the numbers themselves seemed fictional. Gambling, failed investments, a lifetime of aristocratic entitlement unsupported by aristocratic competence. When the creditors came, they found nothing. The Valmont estate had been mortgaged twice over. The servants had already fled. Seraphine's mother had died years earlier. The only remaining asset was Seraphine herself. Not as collateral. The Northern Territories were brutal, but they were not medieval. She was offered protection under Blackthorne guardianship, a polite euphemism that meant she would live inside the keep indefinitely, attend court functions as a decorative symbol of the Duke's generosity, and remain entirely dependent upon a man she had never met. She accepted because the alternative was destitution. Now she stood in his hall watching him dismantle a man's entire existence with the emotional engagement of someone reviewing a shipping manifest, and she felt two things simultaneously that should have been mutually exclusive: terror, and a recognition so sharp it cut through every defense she had built since her father's death. Cadric Blackthorne was not performing cruelty. He was performing necessity, and she understood the difference because she had spent the last 3 months watching polite men destroy her family with smiles, handshakes, and legal documents that stripped everything away while offering condolences. At least the Duke had the decency to be honest about what he was. The court dispersed slowly after Crewe was dragged away. Nobles filed out through the arched corridors in clusters, their voices hushed, their movements careful. Nobody lingered near the throne. Nobody wanted to be the last person in the room with the Duke. Seraphine turned to leave with the others. "Lady Valmont." His voice stopped her the way a hand stops a door from closing. Not loud, not sharp, simply present in a way that made everything else irrelevant. She turned back. Cadric had not moved from the throne. His gaze was fixed on her with an intensity that felt physical, like standing too close to a furnace. He studied her face the way a cartographer studies uncharted territory, methodically, with an awareness that what he was looking at might be more complex than it appeared. "You did not look away," he said. "Should I have?" "Everyone else did." "Everyone else has something to lose, Your Grace." The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile. Something raw, something he probably did not allow himself often. "You believe having nothing makes you brave?" "I believe having nothing makes me observant. Brave people charge into danger. I just didn't see the point in pretending it wasn't there." Silence stretched between them. The torches along the walls guttered in the draft, throwing shadows that moved like living things across the stone. "Dinner," Cadric said finally. "Tomorrow evening. My private chambers. You will attend." It was not a question. It was not an invitation. It was a territorial marker driven into the ground between them, and they both knew it. "And if I decline?" "Then you decline." His expression did not change. "But you will not." Seraphine held his gaze for 3 full seconds before turning away without another word. Her heartbeat hammered beneath her ribs as she walked through the arched doorway and into the candlelit corridor beyond. She did not look back. She did not need to. She could feel his eyes on her spine like a blade pressed flat against skin. The private dinner was a performance designed to look intimate. Cadric's personal chambers occupied the highest floor of the keep's western tower. Stone walls softened by tapestries depicting hunts and battles. A fireplace large enough to stand inside. A mahogany table set for 2 with silver cutlery and crystal glasses that caught the firelight like trapped lightning. He was already seated when she arrived. Black coat, no gloves tonight. His hands resting on the table were scarred across the knuckles. Not decorative scars, not dueling scars, but the kind earned through years of work that no aristocrat should have performed personally. Seraphine sat across from him. A servant poured wine and vanished. "You eat with prisoners in towers," she said. "Very dramatic." "I eat alone," Cadric corrected. "Towers have nothing to do with it. I simply prefer my food without political conversation." "Then why am I here?" He cut into the roasted pheasant without looking up. "Because you are the only person in this keep who has not yet tried to manipulate me. I find that interesting enough to tolerate company." "Give it time." "I intend to." They ate in silence for several minutes. The fire cracked and shifted. Wind screamed against the tower windows. Your father owed me 47,000 crowns, Kedrick said eventually. I am aware. The debt transfers to you under territorial law. You understand this. I understand that I am sitting in a tower eating pheasant with the man who owns my debt. Yes. The symbolism is not lost on me. Symbolism. He set down his knife. Your father gambled his estate into ruin, mortgaged his family's future to fund his own incompetence, and died leaving you nothing except my protection. That is not symbolism. That is consequence. Seraphine's fingers tightened around her wine glass. She forced them to relax. You did not invite me here to discuss my father's failures. You could have sent a clerk for that. No, I invited you because I wanted to see something. What? Whether you would come. The honesty of it landed like a slap, not cruel, not manipulative, just devastatingly direct. You are testing me, Seraphine said quietly. I am always testing everyone. The difference is that most people fail within the first 30 seconds. And me? Kedrick lifted his wine glass. The firelight turned the liquid the color of old blood. You are still sitting here. Over the weeks that followed, Blackthorne Keep transformed from a prison into something far more dangerous, a labyrinth she could not escape because she no longer wanted to. Kedrick assigned her a permanent seat beside his throne during council sessions. He did not explain why. He did not ask permission. One morning, a servant simply appeared at her chamber door with instructions and a gown that fit her perfectly for the first time since she had arrived. The nobility noticed immediately. At first, the whispers were cautious, polite speculation dressed up as concern. The Duke has taken an interest in the Valmont girl. Curious, given her family's disgrace. Perhaps he intends to use her as leverage against the southern houses. But the whispers sharpened within days. Because Kedrick did not use Seraphine as leverage, he used her as a mirror. During councils, he would present decisions and then watch her face for reactions she could not quite suppress. When she frowned, he noticed. When she looked away, he noticed more. And after the sessions ended and the nobles filed out, he would find her in the corridors and ask the question no duke should ask a ward under his protection. You disagreed with the taxation order. I did not say anything. Your face said everything. You have the worst poker face in the entire Northern Territory. Perhaps I simply think taxing tenant farmers during a famine is short-sighted. Short-sighted. He stopped walking. Every lord in that room congratulated me on fiscal discipline. Every lord in that room is terrified of you. Terror is not agreement. It does not need to be. No. But it also does not produce accurate information. You are surrounded by men who will tell you exactly what you want to hear until the moment it is too late for the truth to matter. Something shifted behind his eyes. A crack in the architecture, so small that anyone else would have missed it entirely. He said nothing. He turned and walked away. But the next morning, the taxation order was revised. That was the pattern. Kedrick never acknowledged her influence directly. He never thanked her. He never admitted that her perspective altered his calculations. But the evidence accumulated like snowfall, invisible in any single moment, undeniable in its accumulation. And the court began to understand what was happening even before Kedrick did. The ruthless Duke of the North was not merely keeping a ward. He was orbiting her. The way a planet orbits a sun it did not choose and cannot escape. Lord Lucien Arden arrived at Blackthorne Keep on a Tuesday afternoon beneath pale winter sunlight, riding a white stallion and wearing a smile that could have charmed the locks off a vault door. He was 31, aristocratic in the specific way that meant generations of careful breeding had produced cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and manners polished enough to hide almost anything. His family controlled the southeastern territories, rich farmland, busy ports, profitable trade routes. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never been refused anything worth wanting. Your Grace, Lucien bowed before the throne with theatrical precision. I bring greetings from the Arden territories and a proposal for joint winter commerce that I believe will benefit both our houses considerably. Commerce. Kedrick's tone suggested he had already identified 14 possible motives behind the visit and found none of them interesting. You traveled 300 miles in winter to discuss trade agreements that your steward could have sent by courier. Some conversations deserve the personal touch. Some conversations are excuses for surveillance. Sit down, Arden. You're making my guards nervous. Lucien laughed. The sound was warm and genuine and entirely calculated. Over the following days, he integrated himself into court life with the precision of a surgeon inserting a blade. He charmed the older ladies. He impressed the younger lords. He told stories that made servants laugh and dropped political insights at dinner that made counselors lean forward in their chairs. And he pursued Seraphine with the relentless elegance of a siege conducted entirely through flattery. Lady Valmont! He intercepted her in the gallery one afternoon while she was examining a portrait of Cadric's grandfather. You look like someone trying to solve a puzzle. I am looking at a painting. You're looking at the painting of a man who conquered 6 territories before he was 40 and died alone in a room full of people who feared him. I imagine the resemblance to his grandson concerns you. Seraphine turned to face him. Lucien's smile had not changed, but his eyes had. They were sharp now, assessing. You speak very freely about the Duke in his own home, she said. Freedom is a habit of mine. I find cages uncomfortable. Then perhaps you should avoid castles. He laughed again. This time it reached his eyes, and Seraphine realized with uncomfortable clarity that Lucien Arden was not merely charming. He was intelligent, dangerously intelligent, the kind of intelligence that understood exactly how much truth to mix with flattery to make both irresistible. Walk with me, he said. The gardens are frozen solid, but I am told the ice formations on the eastern fountains are extraordinary. I have duties. You have a seat beside a throne that is not yours. That is not duty. That is decoration. His voice softened. You deserve better than being someone's ornament, Lady Valmont. The word struck something she had been carefully not examining, the specific loneliness of being valued without being seen, of sitting beside the most powerful man in the north and knowing that his attention was a form of control disguised as interest. She did not walk with Lucien that afternoon, but she thought about it for hours afterward. And that was enough. Cadric noticed the shift before anyone told him. He noticed the way Seraphine's attention divided during council sessions. He noticed the half-second delay before she responded to his questions in the corridors. He noticed the faint scent of bergamot on her sleeve. Lucien's cologne. After an afternoon she claimed to have spent in the library. He said nothing. He said nothing for 9 days while Lucien danced with Seraphine at the autumn reception. He said nothing when Lucien offered her his arm during the evening promenade. He said nothing when his own steward reported that Arden had commissioned a silver bracelet from the Keep's jeweler with the Valmont crest engraved on the clasp. On the 10th day, Cadric summoned his spymaster. Everything, the Duke ordered. Every letter Arden has sent since arriving, every meeting he has held outside scheduled functions, every conversation his servants have had with mine. I want the contents of his private correspondence decoded and on my desk by morning. Your Grace, Lord Arden is a guest under diplomatic protection. I did not ask for a legal opinion. I asked for intelligence. Provide it, or I will find someone who can. The spymaster left without another word. That night, Cadric stood alone on the frozen balcony of his tower while wind tore through the battlements like something alive and furious. Below him, Blackthorne Keep spread across the landscape in sharp angles of black stone and iron, a fortress built by men who understood that beauty was a luxury and survival was not. He gripped the railing until his knuckles whitened. This was weakness. He recognized it with the clinical precision of a man diagnosing his own disease. Seraphine Valmont had entered his domain as a debt, a burden, a political inconvenience to be managed, and eventually married off to some minor lord in exchange for favorable trade terms. Instead, she had become the single point of vulnerability in an empire built specifically to have none. He did not want her the way men typically wanted women. Desire was simple. Desire could be satisfied and discarded. What consumed him was something structural, the terrifying recognition that she occupied a space inside his calculations that no amount of discipline could eliminate. She had become load-bearing. Remove her, and something fundamental in the architecture of his control would collapse. He hated it. He hated it the way a general hates the single bridge his entire army depends upon. Not because the bridge was flawed, but because dependency itself was the flaw. And Lucien Arden knew it. That was the worst part. The man had arrived with a smile and a trade proposal, and the surgical instinct to identify exactly where the Duke of the North was weakest. The intelligence report arrived at dawn. Cadric read it twice in silence. Then he closed the folder, placed both hands flat on his desk, and stared at the wall for a very long time. Lucien Arden had not come to Blackthorne Keep for commerce. He had come to take everything. 3 days later, the Winter Court assembled for the formal reception honoring the Arden delegation's departure. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across 200 guests in silk and velvet. The orchestra played something elegant and forgettable. Wine flowed like a river with no particular destination. Lucien found Seraphine near the eastern windows where frost patterns crawled across the glass like frozen lightning. "I leave tomorrow," he said. "But I wanted you to know that your presence has been the single redeeming quality of this frozen fortress." "You flatter easily." "I flatter precisely. There is a difference." He reached for her hand. "Come south with me. The Ardennes territories are warm. The politics are civilized. You would thrive there in ways this place will never allow." Seraphine stared at him. For one suspended moment, the offer shimmered with possibility. Freedom from the keep, from the Duke's gravitational pull, from the suffocating weight of being wanted by a man who expressed desire the way other men express threats. "I cannot," she said. "You mean he will not allow it?" "I mean I cannot." Lucien studied her face with an expression that shifted from warmth to something colder and more precise. "You are protecting him." "I am protecting myself." "From what?" She did not answer. Lucien held her hand for a moment longer than propriety allowed. Then he lifted it slowly and pressed his lips against her knuckles. The gesture was elegant, romantic, and perfectly calibrated to be visible from across the entire ballroom. The sound of shattering crystal cut through the orchestra like a gunshot. Every head turned. Cadric Blackthorne stood 30 feet away. A broken wine glass lay in fragments at his feet. Blood ran freely from his right palm where the crystal had shattered inside his grip. He did not look at the blood. He did not look at the broken glass. He looked at Lucien Arden with an expression that made two nearby noblewomen physically step backward. The orchestra faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence. The entire ballroom held its breath the way a forest holds its breath when a predator breaks the tree line. Lucien released Seraphine's hand slowly. His smile remained, but something behind it had recalibrated. The charming aristocrat was still present, but beneath the mask, the strategist was already mapping exits. Cadric said nothing. He wrapped a napkin around his bleeding hand with mechanical precision, turned, and walked out of the ballroom without a word. His boots echoed across the marble in the absolute silence that followed. The doors closed behind him with the finality of a sentence being passed. Nobody moved for 11 seconds. Then the whispers began, and they spread through Blackthorne Keep like fire through dry timber. Savage, unstoppable, and hungry for everything they could consume. The Duke of the North. The man who ruled through fear and iron discipline and the absolute elimination of weakness. Jealous. Seraphine stood frozen beside the eastern windows, Lucien's cologne still lingering on her skin, the ghost of his lips still pressed against her hand, and the image of blood dripping from Cadric's palm burned into her memory with a clarity that nothing would ever erase. She understood something in that moment that terrified her more than the Duke's power, more than Lucien's calculated warmth, more than the political machinery grinding around her like the gears of a clock built to crush anyone caught between them. She understood that Cadric Blackthorne had not broken that glass out of anger. He had broken it because, for one unguarded second, the control he had spent his entire life constructing had failed completely. And the thing that had destroyed it was not a conspiracy or a military threat or a political rival. It was the sight of another man's mouth touching her skin. And somewhere in the corridors of Blackthorne Keep, behind closed doors and bleeding hands, and the suffocating silence of a man who had never once allowed himself to need anything he could not simply take, the most dangerous duke in Edevane was discovering that some battles could not be won with fear. Some battles required surrender. And Cadric Blackthorne did not know how to surrender. Not yet. The blood had dried by the time Cadric reached his private chambers. He did not call for a physician. He sat at his desk in the dark, unwrapped the napkin from his right hand, and examined the damage by candlelight with the detached precision of a man cataloging evidence against himself. 2 shallow cuts across the palm. 1 deeper laceration between the index and middle finger where the crystal stem had snapped. Nothing that required stitching, nothing that would impair function. The hand would heal. What had broken inside the ballroom would not. He poured whiskey over the wounds without flinching. The alcohol burned clean through the cuts and dripped onto the oak desk in thin amber streaks. He watched it pool between the grain lines the way a man watches a river find its course. Not because it was interesting, but because staring at anything else meant confronting the image still seared behind his eyes. Lucienne Arden's mouth on her skin. Cedric closed his fist. The cuts reopened. He did not care. 17 years he had spent constructing this. Every alliance measured, every vulnerability identified and sealed before it could be exploited. He had watched his own father die in a room surrounded by men who had sworn loyalty and delivered poison, and he had learned the only lesson that mattered. Attachment was not a feeling, it was a structural failure. And structural failures brought down empires long before enemies ever could. He had lived by that principle with absolute discipline. Until 9 weeks ago, when a woman with borrowed clothes and a dead father's debts had walked into his hall and looked at him like he was a problem worth understanding, rather than a threat worth avoiding. A knock at the door. Enter. Matthias Cray stepped inside. The spymaster was 53 years old, with a face built for bad news, and the posture of a man who had learned to deliver it quickly. He carried a leather folder thick enough to suggest that the contents would ruin someone's evening considerably. The full report on Arden, Matthias said, placing the folder on the desk, including decoded correspondence from the last 6 weeks. Summarize. He has been writing to 4 noble houses, Caro, Dunmere, Hulstrom, Vexley. The letters reference something called the Accord of Restoration. From what we can decode, it is a formal pact to dismantle Blackthorne authority over the Northern Territories and redistribute power among the signatories. Cedric opened the folder. He read for 2 full minutes in silence. Matthias stood motionless, accustomed to the Duke's processing speed and the dangerous stillness that accompanied it. The assassination, Cedric said finally. When? The Winter Summit. 3 weeks from now. Arden's letters suggest the strike will occur during the formal banquet when security protocols shift to ceremonial guard. The weapon of choice is not specified, but the Hulstrom family has recently acquired a substantial quantity of distilled foxglove through a southern apothecary. Poison. Administered in wine. Likely yours. Cedric closed the folder. He placed both hands flat on the desk, one clean, one bloodied, and stared at Matthias with an expression that contained no surprise whatsoever. And Lady Valmont? Matthias hesitated. That hesitation told Cedric everything he needed to know before the words arrived. Arden's letters to Lord Caro reference her specifically. She is described as, and I am quoting directly, the keystone of the entire architecture. The plan involves marrying her after your removal to legitimize territorial claims through her family's historical ties to the eastern borders. She knows about this? No. Everything suggests she is unaware. Arden has been cultivating her trust as a separate operation from the political conspiracy. She is an asset to him, not an accomplice. Cedric's jaw tightened so hard that the muscles along his neck visibly corded. An asset. Your Grace, you must advise nothing. You must gather intelligence. You must verify sources. And you must ensure that every piece of evidence in that folder is authenticated beyond any possibility of dispute. He stood. Because when I destroy Lucian Arden, I will do it with facts, not fury, and the entire kingdom will watch. And if Lady Valmont is not your concern. Matthias left. The door closed. Cedric stood alone in his chambers while the wind screamed through the tower's arrow slits like something trapped and furious. She was the keystone. That was the word Arden had used, the piece that held the arch together. Remove it, and the entire structure collapsed. Cedric understood that language because he understood architecture. He understood load-bearing elements and stress distribution and the mathematics of how much weight a single point could carry before fracturing. Seraphine Valmont had become load-bearing in two empires simultaneously. Arden needed her to legitimize conquest. Kedrick needed her for reasons he could not articulate without confronting a vulnerability so fundamental that naming it felt like handing an enemy a map to his weakest fortification. He poured another glass of whiskey, drank it standing, poured a second. The question was not whether to act. The question was whether to tell her the truth. He did not sleep that night. Morning arrived gray and bitter, winter pressing against Blackthorne Keep like a fist slowly closing. Seraphine found him in the council chamber before anyone else had risen. He was already dressed in full court attire, black coat, silver buttons, the Blackthorne wolf embroidered above his heart. His injured hand was gloved. "You are bleeding through the leather," Seraphine said from the doorway. Kedrick glanced down at his right hand. A small dark stain had spread across the palm of the glove. He flexed his fingers without expression. "Sit down," he said. "I prefer standing when I'm about to be interrogated." "This is not an interrogation." "Then why does it feel like one?" He turned to face her. Something in his expression had changed overnight. The controlled distance she had grown accustomed to, the calculated detachment that kept everyone at arm's length, had been replaced by something raw. Not warmth, not vulnerability. Something closer to the expression of a man standing in a burning building who has just realized the exits are sealed. "Lucian Arden is planning to kill me," Kedrick said. The words dropped into the silence between them like stones into deep water. Seraphine's face did not change immediately. The reaction traveled inward first. A tightening behind her eyes, a subtle shift in her breathing, the kind of physical response that the body produces before the mind has fully processed information it does not want to accept. That is a significant accusation. It is not an accusation. It is verified intelligence. He removed the leather folder from inside his coat and placed it on the council table. 4 noble houses, a formal conspiracy, assassination by poison during the winter summit, and a plan to marry you within 60 days of my death to consolidate territorial claims. Seraphine stared at the folder. She did not open it. "Marry me. You are the legitimizing mechanism. Your family's historical claims to the eastern border territories make you the legal bridge between Arden's southern holdings and the northern territories he intends to seize. Without you, the conquest has no legal foundation. With you, it becomes a marriage alliance that half the kingdom's judiciary would be forced to recognize. And you believe I knew about this?" "No." The single word surprised her visibly. Her chin lifted. Her shoulders, which had been bracing for an attack, settled half an inch. "No," Kedrick repeated. "If you were complicit, you would have been smarter about it. You would not have let him kiss your hand in front of 200 witnesses. You would not have worn his cologne in my corridors. You would have maintained the same careful distance you maintain with every other man in this keep." He paused. "Including me. Then why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what you are standing inside." The sentence landed differently than either of them expected. Seraphine searched his face for the calculation she had learned to expect, the strategic motive, the leverage play, the transactional logic that governed every interaction within Blackthorne walls. She found none of it. She found exhaustion instead. The specific exhaustion of a man who has spent an entire night at war with his own instincts and lost. "You could have handled this without me," she said quietly. "You could have had Arden arrested, expelled from the keep, eliminated entirely." "Yes. But you told me instead." "Yes? Why?" Kedrick looked at her for a long time. The morning light through the narrow windows was thin and cold, and it carved the angles of his face into something that looked less like a duke and more like a man stripped of every defense except honesty. "Because I broke a glass in front of my entire court last night, and you are the only person in this kingdom who understands why." The silence between them changed texture. It was no longer the silence of two people measuring each other. It was the silence of two people standing on the same side of a wall they had both pretended did not exist. Seraphine opened the folder. She read for several minutes. Kedrick watched her face shift as the intelligence settled. Not with shock, but with the cold, methodical recognition of someone who understood political mechanics well enough to see the elegance of Arden's design. "This is not a coup," she said finally. This is a restructuring. He is not trying to overthrow the system. He is trying to replace you at the center of it while keeping every other mechanism intact. Yes. Which means the other houses are not idealists. They are investors. They support Arden because they expect returns. Correct. So destroying Arden alone accomplishes nothing. The underlying economic incentives remain. Another coalition forms within months. Kedrick leaned back in his chair. For the first time since she had known him, something resembling genuine respect crossed his features. Not the performative approval he offered to counselors who delivered useful analysis. Something less polished and more involuntary. What would you suggest? I would suggest that you stop asking me questions you already know the answer to. Seraphine closed the folder. You need to dismantle the incentive structure, not the conspirators. Make the coalition more expensive to maintain than to abandon. Turn the allies against each other before the summit. That requires leverage I do not currently possess against all four houses simultaneously. You possess me. The temperature in the room dropped. Not physically, something deeper. No, Kedrick said. Listen to me. I said no. You told me 5 minutes ago that I am the keystone of their entire plan. That makes me the most effective weapon you have. If I approach Arden, maintain his trust, feed him information that fractures the coalition from inside, you are describing espionage. I am describing survival. You are describing putting yourself directly in the path of men who view you as a commodity to be acquired and discarded. And what do you view me as? The question hit him like a blow to the sternum. Seraphine saw it land. The fractional widening of his eyes, the involuntary stillness of a man caught between the truth and every instinct telling him to deflect. That is not relevant. It is the only thing that is relevant, and you know it. You did not break that glass because Lucian Arden is a political threat. You broke it because another man touched me. And until you are willing to say that out loud, every decision you make about this conspiracy will be contaminated by something you refuse to name. Kedrick stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the stone floor with a sound like tearing fabric. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, both hands gripping the stone sill, his shoulders rigid beneath the black coat. You want me to say it? I want you to stop pretending that this is only about politics. Everything is about politics. Not this. Not anymore. He turned around. Whatever controlled architecture he had maintained for the last 17 years of public life was visibly fracturing. Not collapsing. Kedrick Blackthorne was not a man who collapsed, but fracturing, the way ice fractures under sustained pressure, cracks spreading outward from a single point of impact. I watched my father die, he said. His voice was low, stripped of performance. 57 years old, surrounded by men he trusted. The poison took 11 hours. I sat beside his bed the entire time, and he spent those 11 hours not in pain, not in fear, but in confusion. He could not understand how the men he loved had decided he was worth more dead than alive. Seraphine did not move. I was 19, and I decided that night that I would never build anything that required trust to function. Every system, every alliance, every relationship in my domain would operate on incentive and consequence. Remove trust from the equation and betrayal becomes structurally impossible. He paused. It worked. For 17 years, it worked perfectly. And then? And then you arrived with your dead father's debts and your borrowed clothes and your absolute refusal to be afraid of me. And I discovered that some structures cannot be built without trust. His jaw tightened. And I have no idea how to build them. Seraphine crossed the room. She stopped 2 feet in front of him, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, close enough that he could not look away without the gesture becoming an act of retreat, and Kedrick Blackthorne did not retreat. Then learn, she said. It is not that simple. Nothing that matters is. The space between them compressed into something electric and inevitable. His hand, the wounded one, still bleeding faintly through the glove, rose halfway before stopping, hovering in the air between intention and restraint. If I let you do this, he said, if I let you approach Arden, feed him false intelligence, fracture his coalition from inside, his voice roughened, I will be using you the same way he intends to, as a tool, as a mechanism. No, you will be trusting me. There is a difference, and you know there is, or you would not be standing here telling me about your father. Something broke behind his eyes. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way a lock breaks when the right key finally turns, a small, precise mechanism surrendering to the only force designed to open it. He pulled the glove off his wounded hand. The cuts were raw, the skin around them dark with dried blood. He held the hand out between them. Not as an offering, not as a gesture of vulnerability, but as evidence. Proof that the damage was real. That what he felt was not strategic and could not be managed and would not submit to the architecture of control he had spent his entire adult life perfecting. Seraphine took his hand. She held it carefully, her fingers tracing the edges of the cuts with a gentleness that had no place inside Blackthorne Keep and existed there anyway. 3 weeks until the summit, she said. 3 weeks? Then we have 3 weeks to dismantle a conspiracy, turn 4 noble houses against each other, and prevent your assassination. She looked up at him. And you have 3 weeks to decide what happens after. After? After the crisis is resolved and there are no more enemies to fight. When it is just you and me and whatever this is, standing in a room without any strategic justification for being there. Kadric stared at her. The morning light had shifted, warming slightly, and for one unguarded moment his face looked younger than his years. Not softer, not kinder, but stripped of the calcified armor that had aged him beyond his actual age. I do not know what this is, he said. Neither do I. That terrifies me more than Arden's conspiracy. Good. It should. She released his hand, stepped back. The distance between them reformed like water filling a space between stones, present but temporary, shaped by the edges of what contained it. I will approach Arden tonight, Seraphine said. He departs tomorrow. If I go to him now, express doubt about my position in the keep, suggest that his offer to take me south is something I have reconsidered, he will delay his departure. His ego will not allow him to leave when he believes I am within reach. And then? And then I become the thing he thinks I am, a frightened woman looking for escape. And while he is watching me, he will not be watching you. Kadric's expression hardened, the momentary vulnerability sealed over like a wound closing. Not healed, but contained. Functional. If he discovers what you're doing, he will kill you. Not publicly, not dramatically. He will arrange an accident that exonerates everyone involved and produces a corpse that generates sympathy instead of suspicion. Then we had better make sure he does not discover it. Seraphine. It was the first time he had used her name without her title. The sound of it in his mouth changed the air between them the way a struck match changes the darkness. Sudden, irreversible, impossible to undo. Be careful, he said. And the way he said it made clear that the word meant something far larger than caution. It meant come back. It meant I cannot lose this. It meant everything his architecture was designed to prevent him from ever saying aloud. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Seraphine. She stopped. When this is over, Kadric said. When Arden is destroyed and the coalition is dismantled and the summit is secured. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. I will answer your question. Which question? What I view you as. The door closed behind her. Kadric stood alone in the council chamber while the winter sun climbed higher over Blackthorne Keep and the machinery of war began turning beneath the surface of everything. That evening, Seraphine Valmont knocked on the door of Lucien Arden's guest chambers, wearing a gown of dark emerald and a carefully constructed expression of vulnerability designed to make a predator believe his prey was walking willingly into the open. Lucien opened the door. His smile appeared before his words. Lady Valmont, this is unexpected. You said I deserve better than being someone's ornament. She lowered her eyes exactly the way a woman would if she were genuinely frightened rather than strategically lethal. I have been thinking about your offer. Lucien stepped aside. The door opened wider. The warm light of his chambers spilled across the threshold like an invitation into a trap that neither of them fully controlled. Come in, he said. She crossed the threshold. And somewhere in the western tower of Blackthorne Keep, standing at a window overlooking the courtyard below, Duke Kadric Blackthorne watched a single candle ignite in Lucien Arden's chambers and felt something inside his chest tear along a fault line he had not known existed. He did not move. He did not look away. He stood there in the dark and let it burn. 11 days passed. 11 days of Seraphine Valmont walking a razor's edge between two men who viewed the world as a chessboard and viewed her as the queen, the most powerful piece and the most expendable one simultaneously. Lucien Arden delayed his departure exactly as she predicted. His official explanation involved extended trade negotiations. His actual reason sat across from him at intimate dinners in his guest chambers, feeding him carefully constructed fragments of doubt about the Duke's military readiness, while wearing expressions of vulnerability so precise that even Kaedric found them unsettling when she reported back each night. The intelligence she gathered was surgical. Lucien had not simply organized a conspiracy. He had engineered a machine. The four allied houses, Caro, Dunmere, Hallstrom, Vexley, each controlled a critical resource that the Blackthorne territories depended upon. Caro held grain supply contracts. Dunmere controlled the river passages for iron shipments. Hallstrom operated the southern pharmaceutical networks that supplied the keep's medical provisions. Vexley managed the mercenary companies that supplemented Blackthorne border patrols during winter. Remove any single house and the coalition weakened. Remove two, and it collapsed. But Lucien had structured the alliance so that each member's participation guaranteed the other's cooperation through mutual financial exposure. Betray the coalition, and you destroyed your own economic infrastructure. Seraphine mapped the entire architecture in her mind and carried it back to Kaedric, piece by piece, like a surgeon extracting shrapnel from a wound. Carefully, methodically, aware that one wrong movement could trigger something fatal. Their nightly meetings became the only honest conversations inside Blackthorne Keep. They met in the council chamber after midnight when the corridors were empty and the servants had retired. Kaedric sat at the head of the table. Seraphine sat 2 chairs away, close enough for quiet conversation, far enough to maintain the disciplined distance they had both wordlessly agreed upon since the morning she had held his wounded hand. Neither of them mentioned what that distance was protecting them from. Hallstrom is the weakest link, Seraphine said on the 8th night, spreading Matthias's decoded correspondence across the table. His commitment to the accord is entirely financial. He invested 40,000 crowns in Arden's military preparations and expects a 200% return through territorial redistribution after the coup. But his daughter is engaged to Lord Sunderland of the Western Territories, and Sunderland is fiercely loyal to Blackthorne. You want to threaten the engagement. I want to expose the engagement to risk. If Hallstrom believes his alliance with Arden could cost him the Sunderland marriage, which represents 3 times the value of his investment in the accord, his financial calculus reverses overnight. And the others? Dunmere can be isolated through his river contracts. I have already planted the idea with Lucien that Dunmere has been skimming tariff revenues. Lucien will investigate because he cannot afford a compromised ally. The investigation itself will create suspicion between them. Caro follows whoever holds the advantage. Remove Hallstrom and Dunmere, and Caro recalculates within 48 hours. Kaedric studied the documents. The candlelight carved deep shadows beneath his cheekbones and along the rigid line of his jaw. He had not slept properly in days. Seraphine could see it in the faint bruising beneath his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that he controlled through conscious effort, but could not entirely eliminate. You have done this before, he said. Done what? Survived inside a system designed to consume you. You navigate political structures the way soldiers navigate minefields, with instinct, with the kind of awareness that only comes from having been damaged by the thing you are trying to cross. Seraphine's expression shifted. Something surfaced behind her careful composure. Not vulnerability exactly, but the shadow of it. The outline of old wounds pressed against skin that had healed over them without fully closing. My father was not merely a gambler, she said quietly. He was a strategist who lost the ability to distinguish between calculation and compulsion. I spent 17 years watching a brilliant man destroy everything he built because he could not stop himself from reaching for one more hand, one more bet, one more risk that he was absolutely certain would reverse everything. She paused. I learned to read systems because I grew up inside one that was collapsing. You develop a very specific kind of vision when the floor beneath you has been unstable since childhood. Kadric said nothing for a long moment. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of recognition. Two people who had been shaped by damage acknowledging the architecture of each other's scars without the pretense that understanding was the same as healing. 11 more days until the summit, he said finally. 11 days. Can you hold this together for 11 more days? Can you? His jaw tightened. The question was not about the conspiracy, and they both knew it. It was about the nightly ritual of watching her return from Lucian Arden's chambers. It was about the bergamot cologne that clung to her clothes. It was about the performance of intimacy she was conducting with another man, while the man watching from the tower window did not have the right to object because he had never claimed the right to anything except her safety. I will manage, Kedrick said. That is not what I asked. It is the only answer I can give you right now. Seraphine gathered the documents. She stood. At the door, she stopped without turning around. He is going to propose something soon, something physical. Beyond hand-kissing, beyond private dinners. He needs to deepen the bond before the summit. I can feel him calibrating toward it. The silence that followed was so dense it seemed to compress the air in the room. Handle it, Kadric said. His voice sounded like something being held together with wire and willpower. However you need to handle it. And if handling it requires... I said handle it. The words came out rougher than he intended, almost raw. I trust you. 3 words. The first time he had spoken them aloud to anyone in 17 years. They fell into the space between them like a key into a lock, and neither of them acknowledged the sound of something fundamental opening. Seraphine left. Kadric sat alone in the council chamber until the candles burned to nothing and the darkness swallowed every corner of the room, and he could no longer distinguish the walls from the emptiness inside them. On the 12th day, Matthias Cray knocked on the Duke's study door at 4 in the morning. That alone was unusual. Matthias operated on precise schedules. He delivered intelligence at designated hours. He did not appear before dawn unless the situation had escalated beyond the parameters of routine. Kedric opened the door in his shirt sleeves. His eyes were red. An empty whiskey bottle stood on the desk behind him beside 3 pages of handwritten notes covered in strategic calculations crossed out and rewritten and crossed out again. Matthias entered without being invited. His face carried the specific expression of a man about to deliver information that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. We have a problem, Matthias said. Define the scope. Total. Kadric's body went still. Not the controlled stillness of a politician managing a conversation. The animal stillness of something that has just detected a predator in its blind spot. The intelligence Seraphine has been gathering from Arden, Matthias said carefully. I have been cross-referencing it against independent sources. Merchant informants, intercepted courier routes, financial transactions tracked through banking houses. And the information she provided about Hallstrom's financial vulnerability is accurate. The river tariff discrepancy with Dunmere is verified. Caro's conditional loyalty is consistent with his known behavior pattern. Then what is the problem? The problem is that all of it is too accurate, too comprehensive, too perfectly structured to enable a surgical dismantling of the coalition. Kadric's breathing changed. Subtle, a half-beat elongation of the inhale. The kind of shift that only someone trained to read bodies would notice, and Matthias had spent 30 years reading bodies. Say what you're saying, Kadric ordered. The intelligence is genuine, but the delivery is controlled. Arden is not being careless. He is being strategic. He is feeding Seraphine exactly the information she needs to believe she is dismantling his coalition because the dismantling itself serves a purpose she has not identified. What purpose? Separation. If Hallstrom and Dunmere defect from the Accord, Arden does not lose his conspiracy. He loses his partners, and partners require shared profits. Without Hallstrom and Dunmere, the remaining resources, Caro's grain, Vexley's mercenaries, consolidate under Arden's sole control at a fraction of the original cost. The realization hit Kadric like a wave of cold water, not suddenly, slowly. The way hypothermia sets in, first numbness, then the creeping recognition that the numbness itself is the danger. He wanted us to find the coalition, Kadric said. His voice was barely audible. He wanted you to feel clever for finding it. He wanted Seraphine inside his chambers because her espionage gives you the illusion of control while he restructures the conspiracy into something leaner, cheaper, and harder to detect. The assassination. Still operational, but no longer dependent on four houses. With Hallstrom and Dunmere removed, Arden only needs Vexley's mercenary company to breach the summit's security perimeter, and Vexley has already been paid. How long has he known about Seraphine? Matthias exhaled through his nose, a rare display of discomfort from a man who had built his career on emotional opacity. Since the beginning, since the night she knocked on his door. Perhaps before. Before. Your Grace, the decoded correspondence I initially provided, the letters referencing Seraphine as the keystone. I have re-examined this with fresh ciphers obtained from a captured Arden courier 2 days ago. He paused. The letters were encoded to be decoded. The cipher was deliberately weakened. Arden intended for us to intercept those communications. He intended for you to discover the conspiracy. He intended for you to send Seraphine into his chambers as a double agent. Because he knew I would. Because he knows you. Better than you want to believe. Kadric closed his eyes. Behind the darkness of his own eyelids, the architecture of the past 12 days reassembled itself with nauseating clarity. Every piece of intelligence, every strategic advantage, every midnight meeting where he and Seraphine had believed they were dismantling a threat, all of it had been choreographed. They had not been playing chess. They had been pieces on someone else's board, executing moves that felt autonomous but followed a script written before they ever sat down at the table. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the desk to stop the tremor and felt the cuts on his palm protest beneath the pressure. The pain grounded him. Pain was real. Pain was not strategic. Pain could not be decoded or deciphered or turned into a weapon by a man whose smile was indistinguishable from a loaded gun. Where is she now? Kadric asked. In her chambers. She returned from Arden's rooms approximately 2 hours ago. And Arden? In his quarters. 2 guards at the door. Standard diplomatic protection. Does she know? No. She believes the operation is proceeding as planned. Kadric opened his eyes. Something had changed in them. Not fury. Something colder. The expression of a man who has just discovered that the bridge his army is crossing has been mined from beneath, and the person who mined it knew exactly when he would give the order to march. There is something else, Matthias said, and I need you to hear it clearly before you react. Speak. The captured courier was not carrying only Arden's correspondence. He was carrying a separate set of documents, financial records, internal communications, strategic assessments, authored by someone inside Blackthorne's own intelligence network. The room contracted. Kadric felt it physically, a compression of space and oxygen and possibility that squeezed the air from his lungs and replaced it with something acidic and sharp. Inside my network. Someone has been providing Arden with detailed reports on your security protocols, your personnel movements, your private schedule, and your emotional state for approximately 6 weeks. The documents reference your reaction to Seraphine specifically, your behavioral changes, your deviation from established patterns. The author uses clinical language. Subject exhibits increasing attachment to the Valmont asset and recommends accelerating the timeline based on your psychological vulnerability. Kadric's hands on the desk curled into fists so slowly that the movement looked involuntary. The tendons in his wrists stood out like cables under tension. Who? The word came out like a blade being drawn. Matthias reached inside his coat and produced a single folded document. He placed it on the desk between them. His hand withdrew quickly, as though the paper itself was dangerous to touch. Kadric unfolded it. The handwriting was precise, economical, familiar in the way that a scar is familiar, something you have seen so many times it has become invisible until the moment it suddenly, violently demands attention. He recognized it immediately. The intelligence reports, the strategic assessments, the clinical observations about his own psychological deterioration, all of it written in the same careful script that had delivered his morning briefings for the past 11 years, the same hand that had decoded Arden's correspondence, the same hand that had placed the leather folder on his desk, and summarized the conspiracy with flawless professionalism. Matthias Cray. The spy master stood 3 feet away. His expression had not changed, his posture remained impeccable, but something in the quality of his stillness had shifted, the way air shifts before a storm front arrives. Not moving. Waiting. 11 years, Kedrick said. His voice was unrecognizable, flat, scraped clean of every human frequency except the one reserved for moments when the mind has processed information so devastating that emotion temporarily becomes irrelevant. The body's emergency shutdown, the last defense before the architecture collapses entirely. 12, Matthias corrected quietly. 12 years. Kedrick looked up from the document. His eyes met the spy master's, and what Matthias saw in them made him take one involuntary step backward. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The expression of a man who understood with absolute clarity that he was standing in front of someone capable of extraordinary violence, and that the only thing preventing that violence was a question the Duke had not yet asked. Why? Matthias exhaled slowly. Because you are a better Duke than your father, and better men are harder to control. Arden understood that the only way to remove you was from inside your own walls, and the only person positioned deeply enough inside those walls was someone you trusted completely. I trusted you with everything. Yes, and that trust was genuine, which made it the most effective weapon anyone has ever used against you. Kedrick moved, not suddenly, with the deliberate mechanical precision of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do and is executing the decision without the interference of hesitation or doubt. He walked around the desk. Matthias did not retreat. He stood his ground, the way a man stands his ground when he has already accepted the consequences of every choice that led him to this moment. Kedrick stopped 18 inches from his spy master's face, close enough to see the faint perspiration along the older man's hairline, close enough to smell the ink on his fingers from the documents he had spent decades writing, some for the Duke, some for his enemies. Everything I built, Kedrick said, every intelligence network, every decoded message, every threat assessment, every piece of information I used to protect this territory, and everyone inside it, all of it passed through your hands first. Yes. Which means I have no way of knowing what was real and what was fabricated. 12 years of intelligence, 12 years of decisions based on information you curated, every ally I trusted, every enemy I destroyed, every threat I responded to, and every threat I dismissed. All of it filtered through a man who was reporting to the people trying to kill me. Not all of it was compromised. Most of the intelligence was genuine. Arden only required selective distortion, a misinterpreted threat here, an understated risk there, small adjustments that accumulate over years until the entire strategic landscape shifts degrees at a time. Degrees, Kedrick repeated. The word tasted like ash. Your Grace. Do not call me that. The command came out as barely more than a whisper, but Matthias flinched as though he had been struck. You lost the right to that title the moment you wrote Subject Exhibits Increasing Attachment to the Valmont Asset in a report designed to help another man plan my murder. Silence. Guards, Kedrick called. 4 soldiers appeared within seconds. Matthias did not resist. He stood perfectly still as the guards flanked him, his expression carrying something that defied simple categorization. Not remorse exactly, not defiance, but the quiet devastation of a man who understood that the 2 things he had spent his career serving, duty and survival, had finally become irreconcilable, and the choice between them had destroyed him long before anyone discovered which side he had chosen. The vault, Kedrick ordered. No visitors, no communication. Place him under continuous watch. If he speaks to anyone, I want it recorded verbatim. Matthias was escorted out. The door closed behind him with a sound that echoed through the study like the ceiling of a tomb. Kedrick stood alone in the room where he had received intelligence briefings every morning for 12 years, where he had made decisions that shaped the lives of hundreds of thousands of people based on information provided by a man who had been selling him to his enemies 1 degree at a time. He looked down at his hands. They were still shaking. The tremor was worse now, like visible, uncontrollable, originating somewhere deep in his nervous system where discipline could not reach. His father had died surrounded by men he trusted. Kadric had sworn that would never happen to him. He had built an empire specifically engineered to eliminate the vulnerability of trust. He had designed systems, redundancies, checks and balances, and overlapping surveillance networks intended to ensure that no single individual could ever hold enough power to compromise his security. And he had placed the man who ran all of it on his enemy's payroll. The whiskey bottle on the desk was empty. He picked it up and threw it against the stone wall with enough force to shatter it into fragments that scattered across the floor like broken teeth. The sound brought no relief. Nothing brought relief, because the damage was not physical and could not be repaired through violence or whiskey or the mechanical execution of security protocols. The damage was structural. 12 years of compromised intelligence meant 12 years of decisions built on distorted information. Every alliance he had formed, every enemy he had confronted, every strategic calculation he had made, all of it was suspect. The entire foundation of his empire rested on intelligence that had been filtered through a traitor, and pulling that thread meant unraveling everything built on top of it, including Seraphine's operation. The realization hit him like a fist to the sternum. Matthias had been the one to decode Arden's letters. Matthias had been the one to recommend the espionage approach. Matthias had been the one to validate the intelligence Seraphine brought back from Arden's chambers each night, which meant Matthias had known from the beginning that Arden was manipulating the information flow. He had known that Seraphine was walking into a controlled environment designed to produce exactly the results she was reporting, and he had let it continue because the operation itself served Arden's purposes. Stripping away coalition partners, consolidating resources, streamlining the assassination into something smaller, faster, and infinitely harder to stop. Seraphine was not a double agent. She was bait that did not know it was bait, operating inside a trap designed by the man who was supposed to be protecting them both. Kadric moved to the door. He stopped. His hand rested on the iron handle. His forehead pressed against the cold wood. For 17 years, he had operated on a single principle: remove trust from the equation, and betrayal becomes structurally impossible. He had believed that principle with the conviction of a man who had watched its absence kill his father. He had built an empire on it, sacrificed every human connection to it, turned himself into something that functioned like a machine, because machines did not need trust to operate. And the principle had failed, not because it was wrong in theory, but because it was impossible in practice. Because no system, no matter how perfectly designed, could eliminate trust entirely. Somewhere, at some level, every structure depended on a human being whose loyalty could not be verified through surveillance or incentive or threat, and that human being was always the point of failure. Trust was not a design flaw that could be engineered away. It was a load-bearing wall. Remove it, and the building did not become stronger. It became a ruin, which meant everything he had built, every defense, every protocol, every emotional fortification, was already a ruin. Had been a ruin for 12 years. He had simply been living inside the wreckage without knowing the collapse had already occurred. The question was not whether to rebuild. The question was whether to rebuild the same way, alone, armored, trusting nothing and no one, or to build something different, something that required the one material he had spent his entire adult life refusing to use. He thought about Seraphine standing in the council chamber 10 days ago, holding his wounded hand, telling him to learn. He thought about his father dying in a room full of traitors. He thought about Matthias writing clinical assessments of his emotional deterioration while pouring his morning coffee. He opened the door. The corridor was dark and cold, and stretched before him like a decision that could not be undone. Kadric Blackthorne walked towards Seraphine Valmont's chambers at 4:30 in the morning, carrying the ruins of his empire in his chest, and the terrifying knowledge that the only person left alive he could trust was a woman he had kept at arm's length, because trusting her meant becoming the kind of man his father had been. Vulnerable, breakable, human. And he did not know if he could survive being that, but he knew with absolute certainty that he could no longer survive being anything else. He knocked once, hard. The sound cracked through the silent corridor like a bone breaking. Seraphine opened the door in a nightgown with a wool shawl pulled over her shoulders. Her hair was loose. Her eyes carried the residual alertness of someone who had not been sleeping deeply. The survival instinct of a woman who had spent weeks living between two predators and had learned to keep one ear tuned to danger even while unconscious. She saw his face and stepped back without a word. Kadric entered the room. He closed the door behind him. For several seconds, he stood just inside the threshold, his back against the wood, staring at the floor. His breathing was controlled but audible, the kind of breathing that required conscious effort because the body's autonomous systems had been overwhelmed by something the nervous system did not know how to process. "Matthias," he said. One word. It told her everything. Seraphine's hands tightened on the shawl across her shoulders. She did not gasp. She did not recoil. Her body absorbed the information the way Earth absorbs a tremor, silently, structurally, with damage that would only become visible later. "How long?" she asked. 12 years. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were dry and hard and stripped of every soft thing she had carried into Lucian Arden's chambers over the past 11 days. "The intelligence," I gathered. "Controlled. Arden fed you exactly what he wanted us to find. Matthias validated it because the dismantling of the coalition serves Arden's restructuring. He strips away partners, keeps the mercenaries, and executes a leaner assassination at the summit. Which is 9 days from now. And our entire strategic framework is built on intelligence curated by a traitor, which means I cannot trust a single piece of information I have received in the last 12 years, and I have approximately 200 hours to rebuild an operational picture of reality from nothing." Seraphine moved to the small desk beneath the window. She lit a second candle. The additional light did nothing to warm the room, but it sharpened the edges of things. The angles of her jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders, the distance between them that had become a geography neither of them knew how to cross. "Sit down," she said. "I do not need to sit down." "You are shaking. Your pupils are dilated. Your breathing pattern suggests you are approximately 4 minutes from either a rage episode or a collapse, and I cannot strategize with either version of you. Sit down." He sat. The chair creaked beneath his weight. His hands found the edge of the desk and gripped it the way a man grips the railing of a ship in a storm, not for comfort, but for proof that something solid still exists beneath him. "Tell me what you know for certain," Seraphine said. "Not what Matthias told you, not what the decoded letters suggested, what you know because you saw it or built it or verified it personally." Kadric's jaw worked silently for a moment. The question forced him to excavate through 12 years of accumulated intelligence and separate the verified from the compromised, and the process was visibly agonizing, like watching a man sort through the wreckage of his own home, trying to identify what survived the fire. "Vexley's mercenaries are real. I have seen them. 300 men camped 40 miles south of the summit grounds. Arden's ambition is real. His hatred for Blackthorne authority predates my rule. His strategic intelligence is real. The man is brilliant." He paused. "And the threat to my life is real. Everything else is suspect. Then we work with what is real. We have no intelligence network. Matthias was the network. Every agent, every informant, every courier route ran through him. Removing him does not damage the network. It eliminates it entirely. Then we do not use intelligence." He looked at her. Something flickered behind his exhaustion. Not hope exactly, but the faint recognition that the woman sitting across from him was thinking in a direction he had not considered because his entire cognitive framework was built on a model that had just been proven catastrophically flawed. "Explain." "You have spent 17 years fighting enemies by knowing more than they know, by controlling information, by operating from a position of superior awareness. Matthias understood that model because he helped build it. Arden understands it because Matthias told him every detail. They are prepared to defeat you inside your own system." "So I abandoned the system." "You abandoned the part of the system they have mapped. Stop thinking like a spy master. Start thinking like a soldier." "I am not a soldier." "You are the Duke of the North. Your ancestors conquered 6 territories with iron and audacity before anyone invented intelligence networks. Arden expects you to operate through information because that is the only version of you he has ever studied. Show him a version he is not prepared for." The idea landed in Kadric's mind with the physical impact of a door being kicked open. Not elegant, not strategic. Brutal and simple and terrifyingly direct. He stood. "I need to wake the garrison commander." "You need to wake everyone." Blackthorne Keep erupted into organized chaos before dawn. Kadric moved through the fortress like a man whose internal architecture had been demolished and rebuilt in a different configuration overnight. The calculating politician, the chess player, the spy master, the man who won through information asymmetry, was gone. Something older had replaced him, something that operated on instinct and velocity, and the understanding that when a man has been stripped of every advantage except his willingness to act, speed becomes the only weapon that matters. He assembled his war council in the armory instead of the council chamber. 14 men standing among racks of swords and stacked barrels of gunpowder and the cold metallic smell of oiled steel. No table, no chairs, no ceremony. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer politics. Vexley's mercenary company is encamped at Thornfield, 40 miles south, Kadric told them. 300 men, professional soldiers, paid to breach the Winter Summit and execute an assassination. He did not specify whose assassination. Every man in the room understood. We do not wait for the summit. We do not negotiate. We do not gather additional intelligence. We march at first light and destroy the mercenary force before it deploys. Colonel Aldrich Vane, garrison commander for 9 years and a man built like a siege engine wrapped in military uniform, was the first to speak. Your Grace, an offensive action against a private military company on neutral ground without parliamentary authorization will be considered an act of war. Yes, Parliament will object. The Southern Houses will protest. Diplomatic conventions will be cited. Letters of condemnation will be drafted. Kadric's voice hardened. And none of that will matter because by the time those letters arrive, Vexley's company will no longer exist, and every lord in Edevane will understand that threatening Blackthorne territory carries a cost that no amount of political protection can offset. And Arden? Arden is inside my walls. He stays inside my walls until the military threat is neutralized. Then I deal with him personally. Vane studied the Duke's face. Whatever he saw there apparently satisfied whatever threshold professional soldiers use to determine whether a commander is operating from clarity or desperation. How many men do you want? All of them. Every soldier capable of marching. Strip the keep to skeleton guard. We move fast, we hit hard, and we do not stop until the job is finished. The keep will be vulnerable. The keep has walls 30 feet thick, and a woman inside them who is smarter than everyone in this room combined. It will hold. Vane glanced at the other officers. Something passed between them. Not doubt exactly, but the rapid recalibration of men who had served under a cautious, methodical duke for nearly 2 decades and were now being asked to follow a man who had apparently decided that caution was a luxury he could no longer afford. First light, Vane confirmed. First light. The council dispersed. Kadric found Seraphine waiting in the armory corridor, her arms crossed, her expression carrying the specific combination of determination and controlled fear that characterized a person who understood exactly how dangerous the next 72 hours were going to be. You are leaving me here, she said. Not a question. I am leaving you in command of Blackthorne Keep. Arden is confined to his quarters under guard. If he attempts to leave or communicate with anyone outside these walls, you have my authorization to do whatever is necessary. Whatever is necessary. Whatever is necessary. She searched his face. The man standing before her was not the same man who had descended a staircase 9 weeks ago to strip a nobleman of his title with surgical detachment. That man had operated from certainty. This man operated from something raw, the ferocious clarity that arrives when every safety net has been cut, and the only option remaining is to move forward with enough force to create a new reality before the old one finishes collapsing. He was terrifying, not because of his power, because of his willingness to risk all of it. Come back, she said. That is my intention. No, I am not asking about your intentions. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the pulse in her throat and the faint tremor in her lower lip that she was controlling through sheer will. I am telling you to come back, not as your ward, not as your strategist, as the person who held your hand in the council chamber and told you to learn. Come back. Kadric looked at her for a long time. The torchlight in the corridor threw shadows that moved across both their faces like something alive trying to find a place to settle. He reached out and touched her jaw. His fingertips rested against the line of bone beneath her ear, not possessively, not tenderly, but with the careful deliberation of a man placing his hand on something he has finally accepted he cannot survive without. "When I return," he said, "I will be a different man. What I am about to do will change things that cannot be unchanged. I need you to understand that." "I understand. And I need you to still be here when it is over." "I will still be here." He dropped his hand, stepped back. The distance reformed between them, but it was different now. Not a barrier, a bridge. Something that connected rather than separated, spanning a gap that both of them had finally stopped pretending did not exist. He turned and walked toward the armory. Seraphine watched him go. She did not move until his footsteps faded completely, and the corridor was empty, and the only sound was the wind howling through the battlements above her, like the voice of something ancient and indifferent, and utterly unconcerned with the fragile architecture of human loyalty. Then she turned toward Lucien Arden's quarters. Because the Duke had given her authorization to do whatever was necessary, and Seraphine Valmont had spent her entire life learning exactly how much damage a woman could inflict when powerful men made the mistake of underestimating what she was capable of. The march to Thornfield took 14 hours through frozen terrain that punished every step. 600 Blackthorne soldiers moved in column formation across landscapes so white and featureless that the horizon disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but the crunch of boots on ice and the labored breathing of men carrying weapons through air cold enough to crystallize inside their lungs. Kedrick rode at the front. No carriage, no entourage, a black warhorse, and a military coat, and the expression of a man who had stopped calculating odds and started calculating costs. The difference between a strategist and a commander, between a man who plans for victory and a man who has decided that losing is not a possibility he is willing to acknowledge. They reached Thornfield at dusk. The mercenary camp sprawled across a frozen valley between two ridgelines, 300 tents arranged in military precision around a central command post. Cookfires dotted the landscape like earthbound stars. Sentries patrolled the perimeter in two-man teams with the professional discipline of soldiers who expected payment, not conviction, and therefore maintained standards that ideologically motivated troops rarely matched. Colonel Vane rode up beside the Duke and studied the encampment through a brass telescope. "They are dug in, fortified positions on both flanks. The central compound has wooden palisade walls. Not siege grade, but sufficient to slow a direct assault." "How many sentries on the eastern approach?" 4 teams, 8 men total, rotating every 2 hours. "Blind spots?" "The ravine on the northeastern corner. It is too narrow for formation movement, so they have not fortified it. But getting more than 30 men through it without detection would require— 30 men is enough." Vane lowered the telescope. "You want to lead an infiltration team through a frozen ravine in the dark against a fortified position held by 300 professional soldiers. I want to neutralize the command post before the main assault begins. Kill the leadership and the company fragments. Mercenaries fight for money, remove the people paying them, and the economic incentive to resist evaporates. And if the ravine assault fails, then Colonel Vane leads the main force through their front gate, and we do this the expensive way." Darkness swallowed Thornfield like a closing fist. Kedrick moved through the ravine with 28 soldiers handpicked by Vane for close quarters capability. The passage was barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. Ice-covered stone walls rose 15 feet on either side, channeling wind into a concentrated blast that numbed exposed skin within minutes. The soldiers moved in near absolute silence, communication reduced to hand signals and the pressure of a grip on the shoulder of the man ahead. Kedrick felt every step in his body. The cold had penetrated his coat and settled into his muscles like something parasitic, feeding on warmth, converting energy into stiffness. His wounded hand throbbed inside the glove. The cuts had reopened during the ride, and he could feel blood warm and wet against the leather. He did not care. Pain was information. Pain told him he was alive and moving and capable of violence, and right now those were the only 3 data points that mattered. They emerged from the ravine behind the command post. The palisade wall was 12 feet high and constructed from rough-hewn logs lashed together with rope and frozen mud. 2 sentries stood at the rear gate, their breath visible in the moonlight, their attention directed outward toward the empty snowfield beyond. They did not hear Kedrick's men until it was far too late. The assault on the command post lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes of controlled brutality in confined spaces, sword work and pistol fire, and the specific kind of close-range combat that strips away every pretense of civilization and reduces human conflict to its oldest, ugliest mechanics. Muscle against muscle. Steel against flesh. The sounds that bodies make when they collide with walls and floors and each other in darkness lit only by muzzle flash and the desperate flicker of overturned lanterns. Kedrick fought with his father's sword, a weapon he had not drawn in 17 years because he had believed that political intelligence made physical violence unnecessary. The blade felt alien in his grip for the first 30 seconds. By the 4th minute, it felt like an extension of his arm. By the 7th, it felt like the only honest thing he had held in years. Something primal surfaced during those 11 minutes. Something that lived beneath the architecture of control and civilized governance and calculated restraint. He was not thinking about politics. He was not calculating outcomes. He was operating on pure survival instinct, the ancient pre-rational awareness that his life depended on moving faster, striking harder, and refusing to stop for any reason, including exhaustion, fear, or the growing warmth of blood soaking through his coat from a wound along his left side that he registered only as heat and pressure. The body knows things the mind refuses to acknowledge. It knows that hesitation kills. It knows that the difference between a man who survives combat and a man who dies in it is not skill or strength, but the willingness to commit fully to each action without reserving energy for retreat. It knows that the most dangerous human being in any room is the one who has nothing left to protect, except the single thing he refuses to lose. And Kedrick Blackthorne had exactly one thing he refused to lose. She was 60 miles north, standing inside the walls of his keep, holding together an empire he had left in her hands because she was the only person alive he trusted. The mercenary commanders fell in 7 minutes. The remaining 4 minutes were cleanup, securing the compound, disarming survivors, and firing the signal flare that told Colonel Vane the command structure was eliminated. The main assault began 30 seconds after the flare arced across the night sky. 600 Blackthorne soldiers hit the mercenary camp from 3 directions simultaneously. The attack was not subtle. It was not elegant. It was the military equivalent of a sledgehammer applied to a structure that had already lost its foundation, overwhelming, decisive, and designed to make resistance feel pointless before it began. Mercenaries are professional soldiers. They fight with discipline and skill. But they also fight with a cost-benefit calculation running constantly in the background. And when the command post is burning and the officers are dead and 600 enemy soldiers are pouring through your perimeter, the calculation resolves very quickly toward surrender. The battle lasted 90 minutes. By midnight, Thornfield was secured. 214 mercenaries had surrendered. 61 were dead. The remainder had fled into the snowfields where the cold would accomplish what Blackthorne's swords had not. Kedrick stood in the ruins of the command post, breathing hard, his sword still in his hand, blood from the wound along his ribs dripping steadily onto the scorched floorboards beneath his boots. Around him, soldiers moved through the wreckage with torches, securing prisoners and collecting intelligence documents from the overturned desks and shattered cabinets. Vane approached. His uniform was torn across one shoulder and a bruise was darkening along his jaw, but his posture remained military rigid. Vexley himself was not present, Vane reported. The commanding officer, a Captain Drennan, confirms that Vexley departed 3 days ago for Blackthorne Keep under diplomatic credentials. The words hit Kedrick like a bayonet to the stomach. Blackthorne Keep. Drennan states that Vexley received new instructions directly from Arden. The assassination timeline was accelerated. The summit was abandoned as the target. The new target is the keep itself. When? Drennan estimates Vexley will arrive within when? Tomorrow. Dawn at the latest. He is traveling with 40 men, an advance team, sufficient to breach a skeleton garrison. Kedrick looked down at the blood pooling beneath his boots. His blood. His wound. His body telling him in the most direct language available that he had already given everything he had, and was now being asked for more. 40 men. Against a skeleton garrison. Inside a keep that contained Lucien Arden and Seraphine Valmont and every piece of his empire that still mattered. 60 miles north. 14 hours of forced march. He did not have 14 hours. Horses, Kedrick said. "Every horse in this camp that can still run. I need riders." "You are wounded." "I need riders, Colonel. Right now." "Your Grace, you are bleeding through your coat. The field surgeon can stitch me on horseback, or he can stitch my corpse when this is over. Get me horses." Vane stared at him for 3 seconds. Then he turned and started shouting orders. 12 minutes later, Kedrick Blackthorne rode north through frozen darkness with 30 mounted soldiers, a wound along his ribs that the field surgeon had packed with gauze and sealed with military-grade adhesive, and the absolute knowledge that if he did not reach Blackthorne Keep before dawn, everything he had spent the last 72 hours fighting for would be lost. Not his empire. He could rebuild an empire. Not his reputation. Reputation was a tool, not a possession. The woman inside those walls, the one person who had looked at the wreckage of his defenses and seen something worth building on, the one person who had held his hand and told him to learn, the one person he had trusted after swearing he would never trust anyone again. He rode through the night with blood freezing against his side and his father's sword strapped across his back, and the sound of hoofbeats hammering against frozen ground like a heartbeat that refused to stop. 60 miles, 14 hours at standard pace. He did not have 14 hours. He had until dawn, and dawn was already bleeding across the eastern horizon like a wound the sky could not close. The horse collapsed 2 miles from the keep. It did not stumble first. It did not slow. One stride the animal was running at full gallop through the pre-dawn gray, and the next its front legs buckled and it pitched forward with a sound like a ship's hull cracking open. Kedrick launched from the saddle before his mind registered what was happening. Pure reflex, the body's ancient machinery overriding conscious thought, and hit the frozen ground shoulder first, rolling twice across crusted snow before slamming to a stop against a stone boundary wall. Pain detonated along his left side where the wound had reopened during the ride. The gauze the field surgeon had packed against his ribs was soaked through, the adhesive defeated by hours of movement and sweat, and the persistent mechanics of a body being asked to function beyond its operational limits. He tasted copper in the back of his throat. His vision contracted to a narrow tunnel and then expanded again as adrenaline forced his pupils wide. He stood. The motion required more effort than it should have. His legs felt disconnected from his torso, as though the signals traveling between his brain and his muscles were arriving late, garbled, insufficient. The horse was dead. Cardiac failure. 12 hours of forced riding through frozen terrain had accomplished what no enemy sword could. It had simply used the animal up until there was nothing left to use. Kedrick looked north. Blackthorne Keep was visible against the lightening sky, a dark mass of stone and iron crouching on the ridgeline like something carved from the landscape itself. Smoke rose from the chimneys in thin gray threads. The banners on the towers hung limp in the still morning air. No fire, no sounds of combat, no visible damage. But the silence meant nothing. Vexley's advance team would not announce itself with siege engines and war cries. 40 professional soldiers breaching a skeleton garrison would operate through precision, not spectacle. By the time anyone inside those walls understood what was happening, the critical positions would already be compromised. A rider pulled up beside him. Sergeant Heron, a wiry career soldier with a face like crumpled leather, and the pragmatic loyalty of a man who had survived 23 years of military service by knowing exactly when to follow orders and when to drag his commanding officer out of danger against their will. "Your Grace, take my horse." "You need your horse." "You need it more." "I can reach the keep on foot within the hour. You cannot wait an hour." Kedrick looked at him. The sergeant's expression was matter-of-fact, not heroic, not sacrificial. Just the simple mathematics of a professional who understood resource allocation. The Duke's presence inside the keep was worth more than a mounted sergeant outside it. Kedrick took the horse. He covered the final 2 miles at a dead run, the animal's hooves throwing chunks of frozen earth behind them as the sky shifted from gray to pale gold along the eastern horizon. The wound along his ribs had gone from pain to a deep, throbbing numbness that worried him more than the pain had. Numbness meant the body was shutting down non-essential systems, diverting resources to the organs that mattered, preparing for the possibility that the damage was worse than the conscious mind was willing to acknowledge. He reached the keep's outer wall as the first true light of dawn touched the battlements. The main gate was closed. The portcullis was down. 2 guards stood at the gatehouse, not the ceremonial sentries who typically flanked the entrance, but soldiers in full combat readiness with loaded rifles and the wired alertness of men operating under threat conditions. They recognized the Duke immediately. The portcullis rose. Inside the courtyard, Blackthorne Keep was in a state of controlled emergency. Servants moved in tight clusters, with the deliberate efficiency of people following orders they did not fully understand but trusted enough to execute. Additional guards had been posted at every internal doorway. The windows on the lower floors had been shuttered and barricaded. Seraphine had done this. He found her in the armory. She was dressed in a gray wool gown with her hair pulled back in a severe knot and a look on her face that combined command authority with a fury so tightly controlled it was almost invisible beneath the surface. Around her, 12 soldiers stood in formation, listening to deployment orders she was issuing with the precision of someone who had memorized the keep's defensive architecture and was exploiting every advantage it offered. She stopped mid-sentence when he appeared in the doorway. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. The soldiers watched. The torchlight flickered. The space between them compressed into something that contained every conversation they had ever had and every silence that had said more than the conversations. Then her eyes dropped to the blood soaking through his coat, and her composure fractured for exactly 1/2 second before she rebuilt it. "Report," she said. "Thornfield is destroyed. Vexley's main force is eliminated. But Vexley himself departed 3 days ago with 40 men. He is coming here." "He is already here." The words landed like a blade between his ribs. Not the wounded ones, the other side, the side that still functioned, which made the impact worse because it hit something that could still feel. "Where?" "The Eastern Service tunnels. My patrols detected movement approximately 90 minutes ago. I sealed the main tunnel access points and repositioned the garrison to interior defensive positions. They have not breached the inner walls yet, but they are inside the outer perimeter." "And Arden?" Seraphine's expression changed. Something darker and more complex surfaced beneath the command authority. Not fear. Not uncertainty. The specific expression of a woman who has been forced to make a decision she knew would define her for the rest of her life, and made it anyway. Arden attempted to leave his quarters 2 hours ago. His guards were overwhelmed by 3 of his personal servants who turned out to be armed operatives embedded in his delegation since arrival. "Is he loose?" He was loose, for approximately 45 minutes. He reached the eastern gallery and attempted to signal Vexley's team from the tower window using a lantern code. "I intercepted him." Kadric stared at her. "You intercepted a man with 3 armed operatives." "I intercepted a man with 3 armed operatives who did not expect the woman they had spent weeks dismissing as a decorative political asset to be waiting for them in a dark corridor with a crossbow and the advantage of knowing exactly which floorboards creak." "And?" 2 operatives are dead. The 3rd is in the vault with a shattered kneecap, and Lucian Arden is locked in the cellar beneath the kitchens with his hands bound and a guard who has been given very specific instructions about what happens if he speaks to anyone. The silence that followed was absolute. Kadric looked at the woman standing in front of him. The woman he had brought into his keep as a debt, kept as a ward, orbited like a man unable to escape a gravity he had not chosen, and understood with devastating clarity that every assumption he had ever made about what protected an empire was wrong. Not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong. Walls did not protect empires. Armies did not protect empires. Intelligence networks and surveillance systems and the elimination of trust as a structural dependency did not protect empires. People protected empires. Specific people. Irreplaceable people. People who stayed when the walls were breached and fought with crossbows in dark corridors because the alternative was unacceptable. "The Eastern tunnels," Kedrick said. His voice had changed. The exhaustion was still there, but something had solidified beneath it. A hardness that was not brittle like his old control, but tempered, forged by the last 72 hours into something that could flex without breaking. "Show me the deployment." They moved through the keep together, not side by side, shoulder to shoulder. The geometry of their movement had shifted. No longer 2 people maintaining careful distance, but 2 people operating as a single unit, each compensating for the other's blind spots with the unconscious coordination of partners who had been forced into trust by circumstance and discovered that the trust was load-bearing. The eastern tunnels ran beneath the keep's foundations, ancient service passages built during the original construction for supply transport and emergency evacuation. They were narrow, poorly lit, and structurally sound in ways that made them ideal for a small force trying to infiltrate a fortified position without engaging the main defenses. Vexley's team had entered through a drainage culvert on the eastern slope, a point of access so obscure that it did not appear on any defensive survey Kaedric had ever reviewed. Matthias would have known about it. Matthias had known about everything. "I need men at every junction point between the tunnels and the interior," Kaedric told Vane's lieutenant, a young officer named Tarek, who was performing admirably under conditions that would have broken most men twice his age. "Barricade what you can, flood what you cannot. I want those tunnels to become the most expensive 40 feet of real estate in Edevane. And if they breach the barricades, then we fight them room by room, corridor by corridor, stone by stone if necessary. This is my house. They are not taking it." The first breach came 20 minutes later. Vexley's men blew through a sealed tunnel junction using black powder charges that sent stone fragments tearing through the service corridor like shrapnel. 3 Blackthorne soldiers went down in the initial blast. The mercenaries poured through the gap with the professional efficiency of men who had been specifically trained for close-quarters infiltration. Fast, disciplined, brutally effective. What they had not been trained for was a duke who was waiting for them on the other side with his father's sword in his hand and the specific kind of ferocity that only emerges when a man has been stripped of every abstract reason for fighting and is left with nothing except the concrete, physical, undeniable reality of people he refuses to lose. The corridor fighting was savage. Stone walls amplified every sound. Steel striking steel, bodies hitting floors, the guttural sounds that men make when violence becomes too immediate for language. Kaedric fought from the front because leading from the front was the only version of command he had left. The political duke. The chess-playing duke. The duke who moved pieces from a distance and calculated outcomes in comfortable rooms. That man had died somewhere between Thornfield and the 2-mile mark where his horse collapsed. The man fighting in these corridors was something older and simpler. Something that understood combat the way his ancestors had understood it, not as a strategic instrument, but as an act of will, the absolute refusal to yield ground. Vexley's mercenaries pushed through 2 more junctions before the momentum stalled. Blackthorne soldiers, outnumbered but fighting in corridors they knew intimately, turned every doorway into a choke point. Every staircase became an ambush. Every corner became a killing ground where the mercenaries' tactical superiority was negated by the architecture itself. The fighting lasted 2 hours. 2 hours of concentrated violence in enclosed spaces that smelled of gunpowder and sweat and blood and the acrid chemical stench of black powder charges detonating against stone. Kaedric took a second wound during the final push. A sword cut across his left forearm that opened the muscle to the bone and made his grip on his own weapon uncertain for the first time. He switched hands, fought right-handed through the last 3 corridors, with blood running from his arm in a steady stream that left a trail behind him like a wounded animal marking its own path through the labyrinth. The mercenary force broke at the final junction. Not surrendered. Broke. The difference mattered. Surrender was a tactical decision, a rational calculation that continued resistance offered diminishing returns. Breaking was something else. Breaking was what happened when professional soldiers who fought for money encountered an enemy who fought for something that money could not quantify, and the asymmetry of motivation became so overwhelming that the economics of courage collapsed entirely. 23 mercenaries survived. They dropped their weapons in a corridor beneath the keep's great hall and knelt on stone floors stained with the blood of men from both sides, and the expression on their faces was not defeat but bewilderment. The specific confusion of professionals who had executed their assignment perfectly and still lost because the variable they had not accounted for was not strategic or tactical, but human. Kaedric stood at the end of the corridor with his father's sword in his right hand and his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood pooling beneath his boots, his breathing ragged and visible in the cold air of the underground passage. Behind him, Blackthorne soldiers stood in formation, battered and bloodied and still standing because the man at the front had not stopped, and they would not be the ones to stop first. Among the captured mercenaries, Cadric found Vexley. Lord Haddon Vexley was 50 years old, with the lean, hard-worn look of a man who had spent his life selling violence to people wealthy enough to outsource it. He knelt on the stone floor with his hands laced behind his head and an expression of professional detachment that suggested he viewed his capture as a business setback rather than a personal catastrophe. Cadric stopped in front of him. Blood dripped from his fingertips onto the stone between them. "Who paid you?" Cadric asked. His voice was barely functional, scraped raw by exertion and dehydration and the accumulated damage of 36 hours without sleep. "Arden, obviously." "How much?" 60,000 crowns, half on commission, half on completion. Completion meaning my death. Completion meaning regime change. Your death was a component, not the objective. And you considered that distinction meaningful. I considered it billable. Cadric stared at him for a long time. The torchlight in this corridor was dim and uneven, and the shadows it cast made both men look like something carved from the same dark stone that surrounded them. "You will testify before the territorial court," Cadric said. "Every detail, every payment, every communication, every name. And in exchange, you live. That is not generous. It is not meant to be generous. It is meant to be accurate. You testify or you die. Those are the options. Choose." Vexley looked at the blood on the floor, at the soldiers behind the Duke, at the sword still gripped in the Duke's hand, steady, despite the exhaustion, despite the wounds, despite everything that should have made a reasonable man drop it hours ago. "I will testify," Vexley said. Cadric turned away. He made it 17 steps down the corridor before his legs failed. The collapse was not dramatic, it was mechanical. His body had been operating beyond its structural limits for 36 hours, and it simply stopped, the way a machine stops when the fuel runs out. Not gradually, not with warning, just a sudden cessation of function that dropped him to his knees on the stone floor. Soldiers rushed forward. Hands gripped his shoulders. Voices called for the field surgeon. The torch-lit corridor tilted sideways in his vision and then stabilized as someone pressed a water flask to his mouth, and he drank without tasting, his body accepting the liquid with the desperate autonomy of an organism that had been overridden by its owner's will for too long and was now reasserting its own priorities. "Get me upstairs," he said. "I am not dying in a basement." They carried him to the great hall. Seraphine was waiting. She did not run to him. She did not cry. She stood at the center of the great hall, the same hall where he had stripped Lord Crewe of everything 9 weeks ago, the same marble floor, the same carved wolf skulls on the throne's armrests, and watched 4 soldiers carry the Duke of the North through the doors with blood on his face and his father's sword still clutched in his hand. "Put him down," she said. Her voice carried the calm authority of a woman who had spent the last 5 hours commanding a garrison, intercepting a coup, and killing 2 men in a dark corridor. Carefully, on the table, move the candelabras. They laid him on the council table, the same table where they had met at midnight for 11 days, the same surface where she had spread intelligence documents and mapped the architecture of a conspiracy that had been designed to manipulate them both. The field surgeon arrived, a man named Calder, with hands that smelled of carbolic acid, and the unflappable demeanor of someone who had spent his career putting soldiers back together after other men took them apart. He cut away Cadric's coat and shirt with efficient strokes, exposing the wound along his ribs, a gash approximately 8 inches long that had reopened twice and was now bleeding with the steady persistence of something that would not stop without intervention. "The arm is worse," Calder said, examining the sword cut on Cadric's forearm. "Deep laceration through the extensor muscles. You will need stitches, possibly surgery if the tendon is compromised. Stitch what you can. I will deal with the rest later. Your Grace, you have lost a significant amount of blood. Your pulse is rapid, and your skin temperature is—" "I said stitch what you can." Calder looked at Seraphine. Something passed between them. The surgeon requesting authorization from the only person in the room whose judgment the Duke might accept over his own. "Stitch him," Seraphine said, "and then he rests. Not later, not after, now." Cadric opened his mouth to object. "If you argue with me right now," Seraphine said quietly. "I will have these soldiers hold you down while Calder works. And you know I will do it because you have seen exactly what I am capable of tonight, and you are in no condition to stop me." He closed his mouth. Calder worked for 45 minutes. Seraphine stood beside the table the entire time, not touching him, not speaking, simply present in the way that a wall is present, structurally, fundamentally, bearing weight that nothing else in the room could bear. When the stitching was done and the wounds were bandaged, and the morphine Calder administered began pulling the edges of Kaedric's consciousness towards something that resembled sleep, Seraphine leaned close. Her lips were near his ear, her breath was warm against his skin. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would. You also told me you would be a different man when you returned." "I am." "I know, I can see it." He reached for her hand. The gesture was clumsy. Morphine and blood loss and 36 hours of sustained violence had reduced his coordination to something barely functional. But his fingers found hers and closed around them with a grip that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with the specific kind of holding on that happens when a person has spent their entire life letting go of things and has finally found the one thing they cannot release. "Stay," he said. The word came out thick and half dissolved by the drugs pulling him under. "I am not going anywhere. I mean stay. Not as my ward, not as my strategist, not as anything I assigned you to be. Stay because you choose to. Stay because—" "I know why," she said. "Sleep." He slept. For 17 hours, the Duke of the North lay unconscious on the council table in his own great hall while Seraphine Valmont ran his empire. She did it without ceremony, without hesitation, without the performative authority that most people in power use to convince others and themselves that they deserved the position they occupied. She simply did the work. She ordered the captured mercenaries transferred to the garrison prison. She directed the repair of the eastern tunnel breaches. She dispatched riders to Colonel Vane at Thornfield with updated intelligence and instructions to secure the remaining mercenary prisoners for transport. She coordinated with the Keep's domestic staff to establish medical facilities for the wounded soldiers. She inventoried provisions, assessed structural damage, and drafted preliminary communications to the territorial court. And she dealt with Lucien Arden. She went to the cellar alone. The guards protested. She overruled them with a look that made both men step aside without further objection. Lucien was seated on the stone floor with his back against the wall and his hands bound in front of him. His elegant court clothes were torn and dirty. His face carried a bruise along the left cheekbone where he had collided with something during the scuffle in the eastern gallery. But his eyes were unchanged, sharp, calculating, still running scenarios even now. "Lady Valmont." His voice carried the ghost of his old charm, thin and unconvincing in the cellar's damp acoustics. "I confess this is not how I imagined our final conversation. We are not having a conversation. I am telling you what happens next." "And what happens next?" "You will be transferred to the territorial court within 72 hours. Vexley has agreed to testify. Every payment, every communication, every detail of the conspiracy. Combined with Matthias Cray's records and the decoded correspondence from your delegation, the evidence against you is comprehensive, verified, and sufficient to ensure that you will never hold title, land, or political influence again. You could have simply killed me. The Duke certainly wanted to. The Duke wanted to, I did not. Because killing you makes you a martyr to the southern houses who funded your ambitions. Dismantling you in open court makes you an example, and examples are more useful than corpses." Lucien studied her face. The calculation behind his eyes shifted, recalibrating, reassessing, arriving at a conclusion he clearly did not enjoy. "You are better at this than he is," Lucien said. "No, I am better at a different part of it. He is the sword, I am the surgeon, and you are the patient who does not get to choose his treatment." "And what about what you wanted? The freedom I offered, the warmth, the life outside these walls?" "You did not offer me freedom. You offered me a different cage with better weather. I have had enough of cages." She turned and walked to the cellar door. Her hand rested on the iron handle. "I would have been good to you," Lucien said. His voice had lost its performance quality. What remained underneath was smaller, rougher, more honest. "Not at first, not genuinely, but eventually. I would have learned. Seraphine did not turn around. That is the saddest thing anyone has ever said to me, because I believe you, and it still was not enough. She left the cellar. The door closed behind her with the weight of something final. Kadric woke at dusk. The great hall was quiet. Firelight moved across the walls in slow amber waves. Someone had placed a blanket over him and positioned a pillow beneath his head. Small acts of care performed while he was unconscious, invisible in their execution, undeniable in their effect. Seraphine was sitting in his throne, not grandly, not performatively. She sat the way a person sits in a chair they have been using all day, settled, unself-conscious, surrounded by documents and correspondence and the accumulated evidence of 16 hours of governance conducted from the highest seat in the Northern Territories. She looked up when he stirred. "Welcome back." "You're in my chair." "Your chair was available and my back hurts from standing in a cellar. If you want it back, you will have to walk over here and take it." He sat up. The motion sent pain radiating from his ribs through his entire left side, but it was a manageable pain, clean, localized, the kind that meant healing rather than deterioration. His left arm was immobilized in a sling. His right hand functioned. He swung his legs off the table, stood, tested his balance. The room tilted slightly, then steadied. He walked to the throne. Each step cost him something, and he paid it without complaint, crossing the great hall with the careful, deliberate gait of a man learning to move inside a body that had been fundamentally altered by what it had endured. He stopped in front of the throne. Seraphine looked up at him from the carved seat with an expression that contained challenge, affection, exhaustion, and something else, a question she had been holding since the council chamber 10 days ago when she had told him to decide what happened after the crisis was resolved. After. When there were no more enemies, no more conspiracies, no more strategic justification for standing close. Just two people, and whatever this was. "Move," he said. "Make me." The corner of his mouth shifted. Not a smile. Something better. Something earned. The expression of a man who has discovered that the most terrifying thing in the world is not vulnerability, but the avoidance of it, and who has decided, not theoretically, not philosophically, but in the bloody, exhausting, physically verifiable reality of the last 3 days, that avoidance is no longer an option. He sat down in the throne beside her, not next to the throne, in it. The seat was wide enough for two people if neither of them insisted on personal space, and Kadric had spent his entire life insisting on personal space, and right now personal space felt like the most absurd luxury a man could demand after everything that had happened. "You ran my empire for 17 hours, he said. "Someone had to." "The garrison reports indicate 0 additional casualties after my collapse. The mercenary prisoners are secured. The tunnel breaches are repaired. And Lucian Arden is apparently terrified of you, which I find both appropriate and deeply satisfying." "He should be terrified of me. I shot 2 of his operatives with a crossbow in the dark." "Where did you learn to use a crossbow?" "My father taught me when I was 13. He said a woman who cannot defend herself will always depend on men who may not deserve the trust." "Your father was a compulsive gambler who destroyed his family through financial incompetence." "He was. He was also right about the crossbow." Kadric leaned back in the throne, the carved wolf skull pressed against his shoulder. The firelight played across the great hall in patterns that looked different from this angle, not threatening, not oppressive, but warm in the specific way that large spaces become warm when they contain the right people. "I owe you an answer," he said. "You owe me several answers. Which one?" "The one I promised in the council chamber. What I view you as." Seraphine turned to face him. The movement brought her close enough that he could see the faint shadows beneath her eyes from her own sleepless night, the small scratch along her collarbone from the corridor fight, the steady pulse at the base of her throat that beat with the rhythm of someone whose body had been through violence and had not yet fully returned to rest. "Tell me," she said. "I view you as the only person who ever looked at what I built and understood that it was already broken." His voice was low, stripped of performance, raw in the way that voices become raw when the person speaking has run out of energy for artifice. Everyone else saw the walls and the soldiers and the intelligence network and the fear, and they believed it was strength. You saw it and knew it was compensation. You knew before I did that the entire architecture was a monument to a 19-year-old boy watching his father die and deciding that the solution was to never need anyone again. He paused. His jaw worked. The next words cost him something visible. I view you as the person who made that solution impossible, not by tearing down the walls, by standing inside them and being worth more than anything the walls were designed to protect. You made the architecture irrelevant, and I spent weeks hating you for it because I did not know how to exist without it. And now? Now I am sitting in a throne with 2 stab wounds and a destroyed intelligence network and an empire held together by a woman who shot 2 men with a crossbow because I asked her to do whatever was necessary. And I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I am of the fact that you are not my ward, not my strategist, not my political asset, and not my possession. Then what am I? You are the person I choose, freely, not because debt obligates you to stay, not because my protection is the only alternative to destitution, freely. And if you choose to leave tomorrow, if you walk out of this keep and never come back, I will let you go. Because the man who would have kept you against your will died somewhere on a frozen road between here and Thornfield, and the man sitting in this chair does not have the right to hold anyone who does not want to be held. Seraphine studied his face for a long time. The fire cracked and shifted. Shadows moved across the great hall like living things settling into their final positions. You are an idiot, she said. That is not the response I was expecting. You are an idiot because you spent 9 weeks circling me like a planet that refused to acknowledge gravity, and then you rode 60 miles with a hole in your side to get back to a keep. I was perfectly capable of defending without you. And now you are sitting in a throne giving me permission to leave, as though I have not made it abundantly clear through every single action I have taken since the night I walked into Lucian Arden's chambers that I am exactly where I intend to be. Seraphine, I chose you before you chose me. I chose you in the council chamber when I held your hand. I chose you when I walked into a traitor's rooms and performed vulnerability. I did not feel to protect an empire I had no obligation to protect. I chose you when I picked up a crossbow in a dark corridor and killed 2 men because the alternative was letting them take the only thing in this frozen kingdom that I have decided is mine. She reached across the space between them and took his face in both hands. Her palms were warm against his jaw. Her grip was steady, not gentle, not tentative. The grip of a woman who had been underestimated by every powerful man she had ever met and had outlasted all of them. You are mine, she said. Not because you own me, because I have decided that you are worth the cost of staying. And the cost is considerable, Keadric. You are difficult and obsessive and emotionally fortified to a degree that would exhaust most human beings. But you are also the only man who has ever looked at me and seen something other than leverage. I saw leverage first. I know, but you stopped. That is what matters. You stopped. He lifted his right hand, the only one that still functioned, and placed it over hers against his jaw. The contact was simple, unperformative. 2 people touching each other in a way that had nothing to do with power dynamics or political calculus or the strategic management of human attachment. Just skin against skin, warmth against warmth. The most basic and most terrifying form of human connection, the kind that required no architecture except the willingness to remain. Months passed. Spring arrived in Edevane the way it always arrived, grudgingly, with false starts and sudden reversals, winter retreating and returning like an enemy testing defenses before finally accepting that the season had turned. The territorial court convened in the 3rd week of March. Lucian Arden stood trial before the assembled nobility of Edevane. Vexley testified for 6 days. Matthias Cray testified for 4. The evidence was comprehensive, meticulously documented, and presented with the clinical precision that Seraphine had spent weeks organizing. Arden was stripped of title, lands, and all territorial claims. His assets were seized. His allies, what remained of them, scattered like birds startled from a tree, each racing to distance themselves from the wreckage before the damage spread to their own houses. Caro surrendered his grain contracts voluntarily in exchange for amnesty. Dunmere negotiated a reduced penalty through cooperation. Hallstrom's engagement to Lord Sunderland's daughter survived, barely, and the financial restructuring required to preserve it cost him nearly everything the conspiracy had been designed to gain. The Accord of Restoration died not with a dramatic collapse, but with the quiet, methodical dismantling of every incentive that had sustained it. Seraphine's architecture, not the architecture of walls and armies, but the architecture of consequence, making the cost of opposition so precisely calibrated that rational actors chose compliance, not from fear, but from mathematics. Matthias Cray was the last matter Keedrick handled personally. He visited the vault on a Tuesday morning in early April. The spymaster had been held in comfortable confinement. Not luxury, but adequate. Books, meals, a window that faced west toward the territories he had spent 12 years betraying through incremental surgical distortion. Matthias stood when the Duke entered. His posture was unchanged. His expression carried the same professional opacity that had served him for decades. But something behind his eyes had shifted during the weeks of confinement. A quieting, a settling, the look of a man who had spent his career maintaining multiple simultaneous identities and had finally been reduced to one. "Your Grace," Keedrick sat down across from him. The wounds had healed. His left arm functioned again, though the sword cut had left a scar that would remain permanent. A line of white tissue across the forearm that he could feel when the weather changed. A physical record of the night everything had been decided. "I have spent weeks trying to understand why," Keedrick said. "I told you why. You told me that better men are harder to control. That is not why. That is a rationalization." Matthias was silent for a moment. Then something in his expression changed, the final professional facade yielding to something more fundamental beneath it. "Your father promoted me from nothing. I was a clerk's son. No title, no family connections, no path into the intelligence services through any conventional route. He saw something in me and elevated me beyond anything I had the right to expect. And you repaid that by betraying his son." "I repaid that by surviving. When your father died, the men who killed him offered me a choice: serve the new order or be buried with the old one. I chose to serve because the alternative was death. And I told myself that I could manage the damage from inside, that I could feed them enough to keep them satisfied while protecting the things that mattered. And over 12 years, the line between protection and collaboration disappeared. The line disappeared within the first 6 months. Everything after that was the slow process of accepting that I had become what I had originally intended to prevent." Keedrick studied the man who had briefed him every morning, who had decoded his enemy's correspondence, who had sat across from him in strategy sessions and council meetings and private conversations where the Duke had occasionally spoken with something approaching honesty because he had genuinely believed, that Matthias Cray was the one person in his inner circle who could be trusted completely. A man who understood something about trust that most people never learned, not because they were too naive, but because the lesson required a specific kind of damage to teach. Trust was not binary. It was not present or absent, real or false. Trust was a structure that could be compromised gradually, degree by degree, until the person living inside it could no longer distinguish between the parts that were solid and the parts that had been hollowed out. Matthias had not been a traitor in the simple sense. He had been a man caught between impossible forces, making incremental compromises that accumulated over 12 years into something monstrous. Not because each individual compromise was monstrous, but because the cumulative effect was indistinguishable from deliberate betrayal. It was the most human form of treachery, and therefore the hardest to judge. "You will leave Edevane," Keedrick said, "permanently. No title, no pension, no territorial residency rights. You will be given sufficient funds to establish yourself in a foreign jurisdiction, and you will never return. Not execution. No. Not imprisonment. No." "Why?" Keedrick leaned forward. His forearms rested on his knees. His scarred left arm was visible where the sleeve had pulled back. "Because you taught me something I did not want to learn. You showed me that the system I built to eliminate trust was itself dependent on trust, and that dependency destroyed it. I designed an empire to be invulnerable and placed its most critical function in the hands of one man because I believed I could verify loyalty through surveillance and incentive rather than through the messy, unreliable, terrifying process of actually knowing someone." He paused. I was wrong, and you are the proof, and I do not kill proof. I learn from it." Matthias stared at him for a long time. His eyes were wet, not dramatically, not performatively. The quiet, involuntary moisture of a man confronting mercy he had not expected from a source he did not deserve it from. "You are a better duke than your father," Matthias said. "I know. Leave before I change my mind." Matthias left Edevane 3 days later. A carriage, a trunk, an armed escort to the southern border. He did not look back as the keep disappeared behind the tree line, because looking back would have required acknowledging that the 12 years he had spent inside those walls contained both the worst things he had ever done and the closest thing to purpose he had ever known. And some contradictions are too heavy to hold while moving forward. Summer arrived. Blackthorne Keep transformed slowly under the influence of warmth and light and the specific energy that radiates from a household whose center of gravity has shifted from fear to something more durable. Servants moved with less rigidity. Guards smiled more frequently. The great hall, which had always functioned as a theater of intimidation, began to feel like a room where people actually lived. The nobility noticed. They noticed the way the Duke conducted council sessions now. Still sharp, still precise, still capable of the devastating strategic clarity that made him the most formidable political mind in the North. But something had changed in the way he listened. He asked questions he did not already know the answers to. He considered perspectives that contradicted his own. He made decisions with an awareness that being right was less important than being right for the right reasons. And they noticed Seraphine, not as a ward, not as a political accessory, as the woman who sat beside the Duke during every council session and whose influence on territorial policy was visible not through dramatic interventions, but through the subtle shifts in direction that occurred after she and Kedrick spoke privately. She did not overrule him. He did not defer to her. They operated as a single system, complementary, interdependent, stronger together than either could be alone. On a warm evening in late June, Kedrick found Seraphine on the balcony of his tower, the same balcony where he had stood months ago, gripping the railing until his knuckles whitened while the woman he could not stop thinking about occupied rooms in a guest wing he could see from the window. She was watching the sunset. The sky over Edevane was molten, gold and copper and deep amber bleeding into the horizon like something being forged. He stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. The contact was unremarkable, natural, the kind of physical proximity that develops between two people who have stopped treating closeness as a vulnerability and started treating it as a fact. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask. Will you marry me?" Seraphine did not answer immediately. She watched the sky for several seconds while the light changed and the shadows lengthened and the world turned slowly toward evening. "You are not asking because it is politically advantageous," she said. "Not a question. It is politically advantageous. You know that. I know that. Every lord in Edevane knows that, but no, that is not why I'm asking. And you are not asking because you want to secure my position. Your position is secure. You have demonstrated that you can run this empire without me. If anything, your position would be more secure without the complications of a formal attachment to a man with my reputation. Then why are you asking?" He turned to face her. The sunset light caught the scar on his forearm and the lines around his eyes that the last 6 months had deepened. He looked older than he was. He also looked more present than he had ever looked, fully inhabiting his own face, his own body, his own life, without the layer of calculated distance that had separated him from every experience he had ever allowed himself to have. "Because I spent 17 years building an empire designed to function without trust, and it failed. And then I spent 3 days building something with trust, and it survived. And the person I trusted, the person who made the survival possible, is standing on this balcony watching the sunset, and I want to spend the rest of my life standing next to her. Not because I need to, not because the architecture requires it, because I choose to." He paused. "Freely and absolutely." Seraphine turned to face him. The light was behind her now, and her features were shadowed, and he could not read her expression for the first time in months. "You are still an idiot," she said. "Is that a yes?" "It has been a yes since the council chamber. It has been a yes since I held your wounded hand and told you to learn. It has been a yes since I picked up a crossbow in a dark corridor. because I decided that this frozen, infuriating, emotionally fortified kingdom was mine and I was not giving it up. She stepped forward and kissed him. Not tentatively, not performatively, with the full, unqualified commitment of a woman who had spent her entire life being treated as a mechanism by powerful men and had found the one man willing to let her be a person instead. Cedric kissed her back. His arms closed around her, both of them, the scarred one and the whole one. And he held her the way a man holds something he has earned through the specific, brutal, beautiful process of learning that strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the willingness to survive it. They stood on the balcony while the sun disappeared and the stars emerged, and the kingdom spread beneath them in the gathering dark. Vast, imperfect, scarred by the violence that had nearly destroyed it, and held together not by fear or walls or the elimination of trust, but by the two people standing at its center who had chosen each other in the wreckage and built something new from the ruin. The wedding took place in autumn. Blackthorne Keep filled with nobility from every territory in Edevane. The great hall was transformed, not into something unrecognizable, but into a warmer version of itself. Candles replaced torches. Flowers softened the stone. The carved wolf skulls on the throne remained because Seraphine insisted they stay. They were part of the history. Removing them would have been dishonest. Cedric stood at the front of the hall in black silk with silver wolves embroidered across the chest. His scarred forearm was visible below the cuff. He had refused to cover it because the scar was evidence, and he had learned that evidence mattered more than appearance. Seraphine walked toward him in silver. Not borrowed silver this time. Silver that had been made for her, fitted to her, designed for a woman who was not decorative and did not pretend to be. The ceremony was brief. Neither of them had patience for extended ritual. When the officiant asked if the Duke accepted the union freely, Cedric's answer was immediate. Freely and absolutely. When the officiant asked if Lady Valmont accepted, she looked at the man standing in front of her, the man who had ruled through fear and learned through pain and changed through the specific, unglamorous process of being broken open by the only person he could not control. And her answer was the same. Freely and absolutely. The kingdom celebrated. Music filled the great hall. Wine flowed. Nobles who had spent months watching the transformation of the Duke with varying degrees of disbelief, admiration, and political calculation danced beneath chandeliers and pretended they had supported the match from the beginning. But late that night, after the music faded and the guests retired and the great hall emptied of everyone except servants clearing glasses and extinguishing candles, the household staff noticed something that would become the story they told for years. The Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne standing on the tower balcony in the cold autumn dark, wrapped in each other's arms, looking out over a kingdom that had been saved not by the architecture of fear, but by the terrifying, necessary, irreversible decision to trust another human being with everything. And any enemy watching from the darkness beyond those walls would have understood immediately why no force in Edevane would ever breach Blackthorne Keep again. Not because the walls were thick, not because the soldiers were loyal, because the man inside those walls had finally stopped fighting the only battle he could never win, the battle against his own need to be known. And the woman beside him had given him something that no amount of power or control or strategic dominance could manufacture. The certainty that being known was not a weakness to be eliminated. It was the only strength that mattered.